Welcome. You are in a quiet place. The night is settled. The world outside is doing what it does when you are not watching it. And you have arrived here, to this hour, to rest. Tonight, we are going to talk about secrets. Not the invented kind, not the secrets of fiction, of novels and films and entertaining stories that never happened. We are going to talk about secrets that were real. Documented, verified by historians working from primary sources. Conspiracies that for years or decades or sometimes centuries were dismissed as exaggeration or myth or the paranoid suspicions of people who saw patterns where none existed. And then the evidence was found. An archive was opened. A sealed document was translated. A set of bones was analyzed. A coded letter was deciphered. And what had been called conspiracy theory became confirmed historical fact. Tonight, we explore 4 of them. They all come from the medieval and early modern period of European history, a time when political power was concentrated, information traveled slowly, and the gap between what happened publicly and what happened behind closed doors could be vast. Each of these stories involves real people, real documents, real consequences, and each of them was, at some point, something that most people did not believe. Let us begin. The first story begins on a morning in October, in the year 1307, Friday the 13th. The date has accumulated, over the centuries, a reputation as unlucky, as a day when things go wrong, as a date to be cautious. Most people who are aware of this superstition cannot explain where it comes from. They simply know it as a cultural fact. Friday the 13th is unlucky. It is a day of bad omens. But the date has a specific historical origin, and that origin is a conspiracy. One of the most successful conspiracies in medieval European history. To understand it, we need to go back about 2 centuries before 1307, to the beginning of an organization that would become one of the most powerful in the medieval world, and then, over the course of a single morning, one of the most comprehensively destroyed, the Knights Templar. The full name was the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. They were founded around 1119 in the aftermath of the First Crusade, when Christian forces had captured Jerusalem and established several Christian-ruled states in the region known as the Holy Land. The Crusader states needed defending. Pilgrims traveling from Europe to Jerusalem needed protecting on the roads, and a group of knights, led by a French nobleman named Hugues de Payens, offered to provide this service. They established themselves at a site in Jerusalem associated with the ancient Temple of Solomon, which gave them their name. The Temple. The Templars. The organization grew rapidly. Within a generation, the Knights Templar had become one of the most significant military and financial institutions in Europe. They had the backing of the Church, formalized by Pope Honorius II in 1129, and confirmed and extended by later papal documents. They had thousands of members, not only fighting knights, but sergeants, craftsmen, administrators, chaplains, and they had an extraordinary financial innovation. A pilgrim traveling from France to Jerusalem faced a severe practical problem. They needed money for the journey. But carrying large sums of money across thousands of miles of varying territories through regions where banditry was common and currency changed at every border was both impractical and dangerous. The Templars solved this with what was, for the medieval period, a remarkably sophisticated financial instrument. A pilgrim could deposit money at a Templar house in their home country. They would receive a document encoded in a way that was difficult to forge. When they arrived at their destination, they could present this document to a Templar facility there and receive the equivalent value. The money never traveled, only the document traveled. The pilgrim was protected from the risk of carrying cash. This was an early form of what we would now recognize as a letter of credit, a banking instrument that is today entirely standard and unremarkable, but in the 12th century was a genuine financial innovation. The Templars became bankers. They managed assets for nobles, for clergy, for kings. They held deposits. They extended credit. They managed the transfer of funds across borders in a way that nobody else could match. By the late 13th century, the Knights Templar were among the largest creditors in Europe. They were owed money by nobles and monarchs across the continent. Among those who owed them money was the King of France. His name was Philip IV. He is known to history as Philip the Fair, a reference to his appearance rather than his character. He was a capable administrator and a ruthless political operator, and by the early 14th century, he was in serious financial difficulty. France had fought expensive wars, the royal treasury was under strain, and Philip had borrowed heavily from the Templars. He also had other problems with the order. The Templars were not subject to French law. As a papally chartered organization, they answered to the church, not to the king. They could not be taxed by Philip without papal permission. Their vast assets within France were not available to him through normal means. And so, Philip began a plan. We know about this plan not from later historians speculating about his motivations, but from the documents themselves. The administrative records of the French royal government, preserved in archives, show the preparation that preceded what happened on October 13, 1307, sealed orders. Philip's agents, working quietly over a period of months, had prepared a set of written arrest orders. These orders were delivered to royal officials across France, to seneschals, to bailiffs, to local administrators in every region of the kingdom. The orders were sealed. They were not to be opened until a specific date. They were not to be discussed. Their contents were not to be revealed in advance, under any circumstances. The date was October 13th, 1307, a Friday. At dawn on that Friday, the orders were opened simultaneously across France, and within a single morning, the Knights Templar, or as many of them as French royal agents could locate, were arrested. The coordination required was extraordinary. This was the 13th century. There was no telegraph, no telephone, no means of instant communication. Coordinating simultaneous action across an entire country on a specific date with sealed orders that maintained operational secrecy was a feat of administrative planning that, when we consider the tools available, is genuinely impressive. And it worked. The Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, was arrested in Paris. More than 600 Templars were arrested across France in those first days. Now Philip needed justification. An arrest on the scale he had ordered required charges that the Church and European public opinion would accept. He had prepared those too. The charges brought against the Templars were serious. They included accusations of denying the faith, of inappropriate initiation rituals, of worshiping an idol called Baphomet, of various forms of moral corruption. These accusations spread across Europe. Some were taken seriously by contemporaries, others were greeted with skepticism even at the time. Many of the Templars, subjected to sustained pressure during interrogation, made confessions. The confessions were used as evidence at the trials that followed. For most of the following 7 centuries, historians debated what to make of the case. Were the charges true? Were the confessions genuine? Or were they produced under conditions of such extreme duress that they could not be considered reliable evidence? The debate remained largely unresolvable because a critical piece of evidence was in the Vatican archives. The records of the papal investigation into the Templar case, conducted by Pope Clement V in 1308, had been thought lost or had not been publicly accessible to researchers. Then, in 2001, a Vatican archivist named Barbara Frail discovered a document in the Vatican Secret Archives, now called the Vatican Apostolic Archive, that had been misfiled more than a century earlier. The document was the Chinon parchment. It was a record of the papal inquiry conducted at Chinon in France in 1308. It recorded that Pope Clement V had sent 3 cardinals to examine the leading Templars, including Jacques de Molay. And the parchment showed that, after this examination, Clement had absolved the Templar leaders of heresy in private, without announcing it publicly. Clement had found, based on the evidence presented to his representatives, that the Templars were not guilty of the charges of heresy that Philip had brought against them. But he did not publicly say so, because Clement was himself in a politically compromised position. He was French. He owed his election as Pope partly to Philip's influence. He was residing in Avignon rather than Rome within French territory. He was not independent of Philip's pressure. The Chinon parchment showed that the Pope knew the charges were not supported by genuine evidence. It showed that the papal investigation had reached a conclusion that contradicted the official narrative Philip was promoting, and it showed that this conclusion had been suppressed. The Templar leadership was not absolved publicly. Jacques de Molay and other leading Templars were eventually condemned and executed. The order was formally dissolved by the Council of Vienne in 1312. Philip's debts to the Templars were not repaid. The Templar assets in France were, in theory, transferred to another military order. In practice, much of what Philip needed found its way into the French royal treasury. The conspiracy had worked, and for nearly 700 years, the evidence that it was a conspiracy, that the charges were fabricated, that the Pope knew this, and that the suppression was a coordinated political act, sat in a misfiled archive. Barbara Frail's discovery, published in 2004, confirmed what some historians had long suspected. The suppression of the Knights Templar was not a legitimate legal action. It was a planned, coordinated, politically motivated operation, conceived and executed in secret. Using sealed orders to achieve simultaneous action, and supported by a pope who privately knew the charges to be unfounded. A conspiracy, in the most literal sense of the word, documented now in the Vatican's own archives. Jacques de Molay, standing at his execution in March 1314, reportedly called his accusers to account before a higher judgment. Whether those words were spoken and what exactly they were is a matter of historical debate, but the record of the execution is clear, and the record of the Chinon parchment is now public. The medieval world was not simple, and the people who navigated it were not naive. Let us move south, into the sun of Italy, into a city of extraordinary wealth, beauty, and danger. Florence, in the spring of 1478. The Pazzi Conspiracy. Florence in the 1470s was one of the most remarkable cities in Europe. It was home to some of the greatest artists of the age. It was a center of banking, of trade, of the intellectual revival we now call the Renaissance. And at the center of all of this was a family, the Medici. The Medici had risen through banking. They were not ancient nobility. They were merchants who had become, through skill and longevity and political shrewdness, the effective rulers of a city that technically governed itself as a republic. The head of the family in 1478 was Lorenzo de' Medici. He was 29 years old, intelligent, politically gifted, a patron of artists and scholars and poets. History would call him Lorenzo the Magnificent. He was also, by the standards of his time, a skilled political operator in a city and a region where political skill and personal safety were closely connected. His brother Giuliano was younger, less politically involved, more personally popular. There was another wealthy Florentine family with banking interests and political ambitions. The Pazzi. The Pazzi were old money, genuinely noble in a way the Medici were not. They had long been rivals of the Medici in the banking world. They had connections to the papacy that the Medici had, more recently, challenged, and in the mid-1470s, a set of overlapping grievances brought the Pazzi into an alignment with forces that would produce one of the most audacious political conspiracies in Italian Renaissance history. The Pope was Sixtus IV. His relationship with the Medici had soured. The reasons were multiple: competing interests in the alum trade, control over papal banking accounts, territorial disputes in central Italy. The details are complex. The result was that by 1477, Pope Sixtus IV and Lorenzo de' Medici were political adversaries. The Pazzi family were Medici rivals. The Archbishop of Pisa, Francesco Salviati, was a Medici enemy whom Lorenzo had blocked from taking up his position for years. And Francesco de' Pazzi, leading the family's Roman banking operations, was ambitious and aggrieved. These parties met. They planned. What they planned was murder. The target was Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici, both brothers, killed simultaneously. The political vacuum created by their deaths would, the conspirators hoped, allow them to reshape Florence. The evidence for what followed comes from multiple sources: Florentine chronicles, papal diplomatic correspondence, the testimony of survivors and participants, later historical analysis, including work by scholars such as Lauro Martinez, whose study of the conspiracy was published in 2003. The plan, as eventually executed, was this: during a public mass in the Florence Cathedral, the Cattedrale di Santa Maria del Fiore, on Sunday, April 26, 1478, at a designated moment in the service, the conspirators would act. The timing was chosen deliberately. Both Medici brothers would be present. The public setting would make flight difficult, and the immediate aftermath, if the plan worked, would allow the conspirators to move quickly to seize the government. The moment came. Giuliano de' Medici was killed. He died in the cathedral. Lorenzo was wounded but escaped. He was helped by companions through the sacristy, whose heavy bronze doors were pulled shut behind him. He survived. The conspiracy failed. The Florentine population, rather than rising to support the coup, as the conspirators had expected, rallied to Lorenzo. The planned uprising did not materialize. The conspirators were, in the hours and days that followed, captured and dealt with by Florentine justice. Archbishop Salviati was among those executed. This is where the story becomes, from a historical standpoint, particularly interesting. The archbishop was a senior church official. His execution was a significant act, one that required justification, and one that the papacy did not accept. Pope Sixtus IV issued a furious response, threatening Florence with interdict, essentially a religious sanction, cutting off the city's access to church sacraments, and demanding Lorenzo be handed over for punishment. This response from the Pope was, at the time, somewhat mysterious to observers outside the inner circle. Why was the Pope so aggressively protective of men who had committed murder in a cathedral? The answer that many contemporaries suspected, that Sixtus had known about and approved the conspiracy in advance, was a serious accusation. If true, it meant the head of the Christian Church had authorized a plot to kill political opponents. For centuries, the extent of papal involvement remained contested. Sixtus could plausibly claim he had known of a plot, but not the violent specifics. The distinction mattered. But the documentary record, as historians have worked through it over the succeeding centuries, points in a consistent direction. The correspondence between Salviati, the Pazzi, and agents of the Holy See shows awareness of the plot at levels of the papal court that reported directly to Sixtus. The speed and vehemence of the papal response to the conspiracy's failure, not condemning the murder, but condemning Lorenzo's retribution against the conspirators, is difficult to explain without assuming the Pope had a stake in the plot's success. Francesco Salviati had met with papal officials in Rome before the conspiracy was executed. The timing of certain papal political moves in central Italy coincided suspiciously precisely with what the conspirators would have needed in terms of political support had their plans succeeded. Lauro Martinez, in his 2003 account, April Blood, concluded that the evidence for papal foreknowledge was substantial. Not definitive proof that Sixtus ordered the killings, the papal documents that most directly address this do not survive, if they were ever committed to writing, but substantial enough that most historians who have studied the case accept that Sixtus IV knew a violent plot was intended and did not act to stop it. A pope who, by his own theological position, was the moral leader of Christian civilization, had looked away from, or nodded toward, a plan to murder two men during a church service in the most prominent cathedral in one of the most cultured cities in Europe. And for decades afterward, this was officially denied. History has a long memory. Lorenzo de' Medici recovered from his wound. He lived and governed Florence for another 14 years. His family's position in Florence was, after the failed conspiracy, more secure than before. The Pazzi name was erased from Florence, their coat of arms removed from buildings, their family name prohibited. Giuliano de' Medici did not survive. He was 24 years old. The cathedral where it happened still stands. It is one of the most visited buildings in the world today. On any given day, thousands of tourists pass through it. Few know what happened there on a Sunday morning in April 1478. Let us travel north now, across the Alps, across France, across the Channel, to England, to a tower beside the River Thames, and to two boys who disappeared from history in 1483 and have never been fully explained. The Princes in the Tower. In 1483, England had a king. His name was Edward V. He was 12 years old, and he had recently lost his father, Edward IV, who died unexpectedly in April of that year. Edward V had never been crowned. He was en route to London for his coronation when the situation around him changed rapidly. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, took control of the young king's journey to London. Richard assumed the role of Lord Protector. The young king was housed in the Tower of London. This is important context. The Tower of London in the 15th century was not primarily a prison. It was a royal residence, one of the most secure in England. Housing the king there was not necessarily sinister. It was the standard location for a monarch awaiting coronation. His younger brother Richard, Duke of York, joined him there shortly afterward. The two boys were seen playing in the Tower grounds in the summer of 1483. After that, no credible contemporary account places them anywhere. They simply stopped appearing. In June 1483, Parliament declared Edward V's parents' marriage invalid, making both princes illegitimate and unable to inherit the throne. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was proclaimed King Richard III. He was crowned in July 1483. The princes were never publicly seen again. What happened to them? This question has occupied historians, scholars, legal analysts, and interested readers for more than 500 years. It is one of the most discussed mysteries in English history. The most obvious answer, and the one that most people have assumed for most of those 5 centuries, is that Richard III had them killed. He had the most obvious motive. The boy's existence, even as declared illegitimate, was a potential basis for future challenges to his rule. Alive, they were a problem. Dead, and dead quietly, they ceased to be. The earliest narrative that explicitly accused Richard was written by Sir Thomas More about 25 years after the events. More's account describes the princes being smothered in their beds on Richard's orders, carried out by an officer named Sir James Tyrrell. More was writing under the reign of the Tudor dynasty that had defeated Richard at Bosworth Field in 1485, and his account reflects the political context of Tudor England, in which Richard III was an enemy and the Tudor claim to the throne was strengthened by his villainy. This does not make More's account false, but it introduces the question of how much of it was evidence-based history and how much was politically convenient narrative. No body was produced. No public announcement of the prince's death was made. No investigation was conducted. In 1674, workmen at the Tower of London, excavating near the White Tower, found bones. The bones were identified as those of 2 children. They were placed in an urn and interred in Westminster Abbey, where they remain. In 1933, a forensic examination of the bones was conducted, the most recent thorough examination permitted. The analysis suggested the bones were of 2 children of approximately the right ages to be the princes, but the science of 1933 was limited, and the analysis could not establish identity, cause of death, or date of death with any precision. Requests to examine the bones with modern forensic technology, including DNA analysis, have been made by various historians and researchers. They have not been approved by the relevant authorities. The bones remain in Westminster Abbey, as yet unexamined by modern science. What do we know from documentary sources? We know the princes existed and were in the tower. We know they stopped appearing publicly in the summer of 1483. We know Richard III benefited from their disappearance. We know that, within a few years of their disappearance, it was widely believed, including among European contemporaries, that they were dead. A letter written in 1483 by a diplomat named Dominic Mancini, who had been in London during the events, states that the princes were withdrawn into the inner apartments of the tower and seen less and less frequently, and that rumor of their death had already begun to spread. Mancini was not an English partisan. He was an Italian observer, reporting what he saw and heard to his own government. His account has been given significant weight by modern historians because of this relative independence. Beyond Richard, other candidates have been proposed over the centuries. Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, was Richard's most powerful ally in 1483 and managed the tower during the relevant period. He later turned against Richard and raised a rebellion. Some historians have suggested Buckingham may have ordered the princes' deaths without Richard's knowledge, either on his own initiative or at someone else's instigation. Henry VII, Henry Tudor, who defeated Richard at Bosworth Field in 1485 and founded the Tudor dynasty, also had reason to want the princes dead. If they had survived into Henry's reign, they would have been potential rallying points for opposition to Tudor rule. But Henry's access to the tower before 1485 was zero, as he was in exile in Brittany. The most tantalizing piece of the puzzle is a figure known as Perkin Warbeck. In the 1490s, a young man appeared in Europe claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes. He was received by the King of Scotland, by the Holy Roman Emperor, by the Duchess of Burgundy, who was the prince's aunt. She reportedly recognized him as her nephew. He raised forces and attempted an invasion of England. He was captured in 1497 and eventually executed in 1499 after an escape attempt. Was he a fraud, as Henry VII claimed? Or was he genuinely one of the princes who had somehow survived what everyone believed had been their death? Henry VII never publicly proved Warbeck was an impostor by producing evidence about the prince's actual fate. This silence is, to historians, significant. If Henry had known the princes were dead, and had evidence of that death, exposing Warbeck as a fraud would have been straightforward. The fact that he did not do so suggests either that he lacked that evidence or that producing it would have been politically complicated. The mystery of the princes in the tower has no resolution that all historians accept. What is documented is this: 2 boys were in the tower. They disappeared. The man who most obviously benefited from their disappearance became king. No credible account of their survival exists beyond Warbeck's claim, and the bones in Westminster Abbey have not been fully analyzed. The conspiracy, if conspiracy it was, succeeded. Whoever was responsible, whatever happened in the tower in the summer of 1483, the silence held. For 540 years, We have been asking the same question, and the answer remains partially in the dark. Let us move now to our final story of the evening, to a city that was, in many ways, unlike any other in medieval Europe. A city built on water, a city that governed itself as a republic for more than 1,000 years, a city that along the way built the most sophisticated secret intelligence system the medieval world ever saw. Venice, the Council of Ten. Venice was unique. Most medieval states were monarchies. Power was concentrated in a king or prince who held it by hereditary right, by military force, or by some combination of the two. The monarch was the state, and the state was the monarch. Venice was different. The Venetian Republic was governed through a complex set of interlocking councils and committees designed specifically to prevent any single individual from accumulating too much power. The Doge, the elected head of state, was ceremonially important but heavily constrained. He was watched. He was checked. He was constantly surrounded by mechanisms designed to limit his autonomy. This was not accidental. It was the result of centuries of constitutional engineering by a governing class of Venetian noble families who had learned through difficult experience what concentrated power could do when it turned against the Republic. The event that most directly shaped Venice's intelligence apparatus happened in 1310. A man named Bajamonte Tiepolo, from one of Venice's oldest noble families, organized a conspiracy to seize control of the Republic. He planned to lead armed men into the Piazza San Marco, eliminate the Doge and the senior councils, and install himself as the new power in Venice. The conspiracy failed. Tiepolo's forces were met with resistance, turned back, and he fled into exile. But the episode shook the Venetian governing class. If a conspiracy of this kind could be organized and nearly executed, it could happen again, and next time it might succeed. The response was the creation of a new body, a committee of 10 nobles established initially on a temporary basis, made permanent in 1335. Their official purpose was the security of the Republic against exactly this kind of threat. They were called the Council of Ten. For the next 4.5 centuries, until Napoleon's conquest of Venice in 1797 effectively ended the Republic, the Council of Ten was the most powerful institution in Venetian governance, and most of what they did was secret. The Council of Ten operated outside the normal transparency of Venetian governance. Their deliberations were confidential. Their decisions were enforced without public explanation. Their files were sealed. And their methods included something that, when historians began fully analyzing the Venetian archives in the 19th and 20th centuries, revealed itself to be a systematic, institutionalized, city-wide intelligence network, the Bocchi di Leone, the Lion's Mouth, scattered across Venice in churches and government buildings and public spaces were stone faces carved in relief with open mouths forming a slot. These were accusation boxes. Any citizen of Venice could write an accusation, a denunciation, a claim that someone had acted against the Republic, and post it anonymously through the mouth of the lion. The accusations were collected by the Council of 10 secretaries. They were evaluated. If they met certain criteria, unsigned accusations required corroboration before action was taken. They were investigated. The result was a city in which the governing body had, at any given time, access to a constant stream of information about what was happening in Venice. Who was conspiring? Who was spending beyond their means? Who was meeting with foreign agents? Who was saying dangerous things? This information was not always reliable. Anonymous accusations could be weaponized, used to harm enemies, settle personal scores, redirect suspicion. The Council of Ten was aware of this and had procedures for evaluating the credibility of information they received. But the sheer volume and variety of information flowing through the system meant that genuine conspiracies and genuine threats were regularly identified before they could mature. The Council of Ten maintained, in addition to the Boca system, a network of paid informants. The Venetian diplomatic service, which was itself remarkable for the period, producing the detailed diplomatic reports called Relazioni that are among the most valuable primary sources for Renaissance history, also fed intelligence to the council. Venetian ambassadors were expected to report not only on the official business of the courts to which they were sent, but on everything they could learn about the people, the politics, the finances, and the vulnerabilities of the states they were accredited to. These reports are still in the Venetian state archives. They have been studied extensively by historians of European diplomacy. The level of detail they contain about the personalities of foreign rulers, the state of foreign economies, the relationships between foreign powers is extraordinary. Venice, in effect, had a foreign intelligence service that was gathering and analyzing information about the wider world centuries before most states had any equivalent capacity. The Council of Ten also had operational capacity. It could authorize actions, the apprehension of suspected traitors, the removal of threats to the Republic. That would not be made public. Not all of their methods were benign by modern standards. The use of secret proceedings, the reliance on anonymous accusations, and the concentration of unreviewed power in a small body created conditions in which injustice was possible and sometimes occurred. But as a mechanism for protecting the Republic against the very real dangers of conspiracy, foreign subversion, and internal instability, the Council of Ten was remarkably effective. Venice remained a republic for nearly 500 years after the creation of the Council of Ten. In an era when most of Europe's republics and city-states were eventually absorbed into monarchies or destroyed by external force, Venice persisted. Its extraordinary constitutional arrangements, combined with the security apparatus that protected them, gave it a longevity that was unmatched. When historians began seriously studying the Venetian state archives in the 19th century, the full picture of what the Council of Ten had been doing slowly became clear. The archives are vast, centuries of records, meticulously kept, of the most secretive body and one of history's most secretive governments. What they revealed confirmed what contemporaries had long suspected, and what the governing class of Venice had been careful never to admit openly. Venice had been running a comprehensive intelligence operation, gathering information, monitoring threats, managing knowledge, keeping secrets for 500 years, and doing it, for the most part, effectively enough that the Republic survived. The Bocche di Leone are still in Venice. You can see them today in the Doge's Palace and in other locations across the city. They are now tourist attractions, museum pieces, objects of curiosity, but they were, for the people who walked past them in the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries, something else entirely. They were a reminder that the Republic was watching, that if you were planning something, if you were meeting in quiet rooms with foreign agents, if you were speaking too freely about the Doge or the Council, if you were doing anything that the 10 might find worth knowing about, someone might know, and that knowledge might find its way through a stone mouth in a church wall to the people who would act on it. Surveillance in medieval Venice was not a technology, it was a social system, built of stone and secrecy and the very human impulse to report what you had seen and heard to those who might reward you for it. It worked, and it was a conspiracy in its own right. A conspiracy of governance, a secret system, acknowledged vaguely but never described openly, that shaped the entire texture of Venetian public life for centuries. We have spent this evening with 4 conspiracies: the suppression of the Knights Templar, a coordinated, documented political operation, planned in secret, executed simultaneously across an entire country, and confirmed by a document that spent 7 centuries in a Vatican archive before being found. The Pazzi conspiracy in Florence, a plot that involved a pope executed in a cathedral that failed in its immediate aims, but whose documentation has gradually confirmed the extent of its reach. The Princes in the Tower, England's most enduring royal mystery, whose evidence points consistently toward deliberate suppression of the truth, and whose physical evidence sits in Westminster Abbey, awaiting an examination that has not yet been permitted. And Venice's Council of 10, history's first documented, institutionalized secret intelligence agency, whose archives reveal 5 centuries of systematic information gathering, covert operations, and the governance of a republic through the management of knowledge. These are not inventions. They are not the products of paranoid imagination. They are documented history. And the fact that most people do not know them in detail, that they have been filtered out of the simplified version of the past that most of us carry, is itself a kind of answer to the question they raise. How many real conspiracies go undiscovered? How many sealed orders are still in misfiled archives? How many documents were destroyed rather than preserved? How many bones sit in crypts, awaiting a science that has not yet been applied to them? We cannot know. History is what survived. The full record of what happened is almost certainly larger than what we have access to. The gaps in what we know are not merely gaps in the evidence. They are sometimes the places where the evidence was deliberately removed. But some documents do survive. Some archives are opened. Some discoveries are made by patient historians working through boxes of misfiled papers in quiet rooms. And when they are, the conspiracy theories of one generation become the confirmed historical facts of the next. Tonight, you have heard 4 of them. You have followed the sealed orders of a French king across the length of his kingdom to a cold October morning. You have been in the cathedral in Florence on a spring Sunday when the light came through the high windows and history changed. You have stood outside the Tower of London in the summer of 1483, watching for 2 boys who would not emerge, and you have walked past a stone face in a Venetian church wall, wondering whether anyone was watching. These people were real. Their secrets were real. And the researchers who found the evidence of those secrets, working in quiet archives, reading old documents by careful light, or doing one of the most patient and important things that human beings do. They were refusing to accept that the past was simpler than it was. Now the past is settled. It is not going anywhere. It will wait for the next patient historian, the next opened archive, the next question asked carefully enough to yield an answer. And you can rest. Your breath is slower than when we began. The weight of the day has settled into the surfaces around you. The secrets of the medieval world are where they have always been, in archives and stones and bones, quiet and patient. Let everything be quiet. Let everything be patient. The night is long and the world is at rest. You are at rest. Simply that. Simply rest. The answers, the ones that exist, will be found, and the ones that do not exist will be waited for patiently, as historians have always waited. For now, there is nothing to find, only the quiet and the slow, steady sound of the night